the hook. The crystal tumbler shattered against Frank Morrison's left temple with the sharp crack of expensive Waterford meeting bone. Blood welled immediately, a crimson line tracing down his weathered cheek as 300 pairs of eyes fixed on Hollywood's most unshakable man. Frank didn't flinch, didn't raise his hand to the wound, didn't even turn to look at Tommy Castellano, who swayed 10 feet away, his face twisted with 20 years of accumulated rage. "You fraud!" Tommy's voice cut through the ballroom like a rusty blade. "You goddamn fake! Show them who you really are!" The crowd pressed back instinctively, creating a widening circle around the two men. Studio executives clutched their martinis, starlets gasped behind manicured fingers, and reporters sensed the story of a lifetime unfolding before their eyes. At the far end of the room, a waiter quietly set down his tray and slipped toward the kitchen. Someone would need to call the police. Frank Morrison stood perfectly still in his tailored black tuxedo, blood now staining his white shirt collar. His steel-gray eyes remained fixed on some distant point beyond Tommy's shoulder, as if he were gazing across a vast western landscape instead of the opulent ballroom where Hollywood's elite had gathered to celebrate the rap of Sunset Ridge, his latest picture. 20 years, Tommy continued, his voice breaking. 20 goddamn years, and you don't even recognize me, do you? Something flickered across Frank's weathered features, a shadow of recognition perhaps, or merely the play of chandelier light. He was 58 years old, built like the ranchers he portrayed on screen, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that spoke of honest work even though they'd never held anything heavier than a prop colt. 45. His hair, now silver at the temples, caught the light as he finally, slowly, turned to face his accuser. "Son," Frank said quietly, and the single word carried across the silent ballroom with devastating clarity. Tommy's face crumpled for just an instant before hardening again. Don't you dare call me that. Not here, not in front of them." The crowd didn't understand. How could they? They saw only what the headlines would report tomorrow, a washed-up method actor, probably envious of Frank Morrison's success, drunk and violent at an industry party. They couldn't know that Tommy Castellano had been born Tommy Morrison, or that the last time these two men had spoken, the boy had been 8 years old and begging his father not to leave for another 3-month location shoot. Frank reached into his jacket pocket. Several men tensed, ready to intervene, and withdrew a pristine white handkerchief. He pressed it to his temple with the same deliberate care he brought to every gesture, on screen and off. The blood soaked through immediately. "You're hurt," Frank said to Tommy, and it took a moment for everyone to realize he wasn't talking about the bleeding gash on his own face. Tommy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Hurt? You think I'm hurt? Look around, old man. Look at all these people hanging on your every word, treating you like some kind of saint. If they only knew, what would you have me do?" Frank's voice remained level, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than 20 years of abandonment. What would make it right? The question hung in the air like smoke. Tommy's mouth opened and closed, the fight suddenly draining out of him. He'd come here tonight with a plan, expose Frank Morrison for the selfish bastard he really was, tear down the legend in front of everyone who mattered. But he hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected his father to just stand there and take it. "Fight back," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Hit me, yell at me, show them you're human." Frank shook his head slowly. "I've done enough damage." Around them, the crowd began to murmur. This wasn't how these confrontations usually played out in Hollywood. There should have been security by now, police, lawyers making threats. Instead, they were witnessing something none of them quite understood. A master class in restraint from a man who'd built his career on playing heroes. Tommy's knees buckled slightly, and Frank stepped forward instinctively, one hand reaching out to steady the younger man. For a heartbeat, they stood close enough to touch, close enough for Frank to smell the whiskey and desperation on his son's breath. "Don't!" Tommy jerked away. "You lost that right a long time ago." He turned and pushed through the crowd, leaving Frank Morrison alone in the center of the ballroom, blood slowly staining his collar, surrounded by 300 witnesses who had no idea they'd just watched a father and son destroy each other all over again. Frank folded his handkerchief carefully and returned it to his pocket. When he looked up, His expression was once again that of the unshakable Western hero America loved, but his hands, for the first time anyone could remember, were trembling. The murmur of 300 voices filled the vacuum Tommy had left behind, but Frank Morrison heard only the echo of his son's footsteps disappearing into the crowd. He stood motionless in the center of the ballroom, feeling the weight of every stare, every whispered speculation, every mental note being filed away for tomorrow's trade papers. Frank. The voice belonged to Maureen Walsh, his longtime agent. Her usually unflappable composure cracked at the edges. She approached him like one might approach a wounded animal carefully, with practiced concern masking deeper calculations. "We need to get you looked at. That cut, it's nothing." Frank's hand found his pocket again, fingers brushing against the blood-stained handkerchief. The familiar gesture steadied him, a lifeline to the controlled persona that had served him for 30 years in this business. Around them, the party was attempting to resume its rhythm, but he could feel the undercurrent of excitement, the way scandal electrified a Hollywood gathering like lightning striking dry timber. Studio head Bernard Kellerman materialized at Frank's elbow, his round face flushed with champagne and anxiety. "Jesus Christ, Frank. Who was that lunatic? Do we need to worry about lawsuits? Bad publicity?" The questions hammered against Frank's consciousness, but they seemed to come from very far away. He was remembering, instead, a different kind of gathering, a modest birthday party in a cramped apartment 22 years ago, where a 6-year-old boy had blown out candles on a store-bought cake while his father packed a suitcase for another location shoot. The boy had asked if Daddy would be back for Christmas. Frank had promised he would. He'd missed 3 Christmases in a row after that. "Frank?" Maureen's voice carried a sharper edge now. "We really should. I need some air." The words came out rougher than he intended. Frank straightened his shoulders, muscle memory from decades of playing men who never showed weakness, never revealed the fault lines running through their carefully constructed facades. "Give me a moment." He moved toward the ballroom's French doors, past clusters of actors and executives whose conversations died as he approached and resumed in urgent whispers once he'd passed. The terrace beyond offered sanctuary, a sweep of manicured gardens dropping down toward the lights of Los Angeles, the city that had made him a fortune and cost him everything that mattered. The November air carried the scent of jasmine and distant smog. Frank gripped the marble balustrade, his knuckles white against the stone. The trembling in his hands had worsened, and for a terrifying moment he wondered if this was what a heart attack felt like, this crushing weight in his chest, this sudden inability to draw a full breath. But he knew better. This wasn't his heart failing. This was 20 years of carefully buried guilt clawing its way to the surface. Behind him, the party continued its elaborate dance of ambition and artifice. Through the glass doors, he could see Maureen working the room, no doubt spinning the evening's events into something manageable, something that wouldn't threaten the carefully cultivated legend of Frank Morrison. She was good at her job, the best in the business. She'd weathered scandals that would have destroyed lesser stars, turned potential disasters into publicity gold. But she couldn't fix this. Couldn't fix what he'd broken in a cramped apartment 2 decades ago when he'd chosen another picture over another promise, another role over the one that should have mattered most. Frank reached into his jacket and withdrew a silver hip flask, a gift from John Ford after their 3rd picture together. The whiskey burned, but it was a cleaner pain than the one lodged behind his ribs. He thought about Tommy pushing through the crowd, shoulders hunched with defeat and rage. Thought about the boy who used to wait by the window for a father who came home less and less frequently, until one day he simply stopped coming home at all. The boy had become a man now 38 years old, though the years hadn't been kind. Frank had followed Tommy's career from a distance, watching his son chase the same dream that had destroyed their family. Method acting, they called it now, the new way of doing things. Tommy had talent, real talent, but talent alone wasn't enough in this business. You needed luck, connections, the right breaks at the right moments. You needed a father who gave a damn about something other than his next picture. The sound of footsteps on marble made Frank tense. He turned, expecting Maureen or perhaps Kellerman with more urgent damage control strategies. Instead, he found himself face to face with Rebecca Chen, a young reporter from Variety whose sharp intelligence and sharper questions had made her a rising star in Hollywood journalism. "Mr. Morrison." Her voice was respectful but determined. "I wonder if I might ask you a few questions about what happened in there." Frank studied her for a long moment, noting the way she held her notebook, the careful distance she maintained, professional courtesies that barely concealed her predatory instincts. In her eyes, he saw the same hunger that had driven his own climb to the top of this merciless industry. "Some other time, Miss Chen." "Of course." She paused, then added quietly, "For what it's worth, I thought your response showed remarkable grace under pressure." Grace. Frank almost smiled at the word. If she only knew how little grace there had been in any of it, the years of absence, the broken promises, the slow dissolution of everything he should have protected. As Rebecca disappeared back into the ballroom, Frank Morrison stood alone on the terrace, bleeding slowly into his collar, while Los Angeles glittered below him like a field of fallen stars. He was about to return inside when he heard his name called from the garden below. "Mr. Morrison?" Frank looked down to see a bellhop from the hotel's front desk, crisp uniform immaculate despite the late hour. The young man held an envelope in his white-gloved hand. "This arrived for you about an hour ago, sir. Marked urgent. The front desk tried calling your room, but when they couldn't reach you, they asked me to find you personally." Frank descended the stone steps, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the marble. The bellhop's face was carefully neutral. No doubt he'd heard about the incident in the ballroom, but his professional training kept any curiosity from showing. "Thank you." Frank pressed a folded bill into the young man's palm and accepted the envelope. His name was written across the front in careful script, but it was the return address that made his breath catch: Shady Grove Sanitarium, Pasadena, California. The bellhop melted away into the shadows as Frank turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper felt expensive, heavy institutional stationery, designed to convey dignity and discretion. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal. "Dear Mr. Morrison, it is with deep regret that I must inform you of the passing of Mrs. Eleanor Morrison on November 15, 1962, at 3:47 p.m. In accordance with her final wishes, we have delayed notification to allow for private arrangements. Your former wife left specific instructions regarding her personal effects and a sealed letter to be delivered to you personally. She also requested that we inform you she forgave you and hoped you would find the strength to forgive yourself. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to discuss arrangements. Sincerely, Dr. Harrison Whitmore." Director Frank's legs gave way, and he sank heavily onto a stone bench beside a fountain where water trickled endlessly into a marble basin. Eleanor. Dead for 3 days, and he hadn't known, hadn't felt it somehow, the way they said you were supposed to when someone who'd once been part of your soul simply stopped existing. She'd been at Shady Grove for 7 years now. Depression, the doctors had called it, though Frank knew the real diagnosis: a slow breaking of the heart, a gradual dissolution of hope that had begun the day he'd chosen another picture over another promise and never looked back. He'd visited her exactly twice. The first time, 6 months after Tommy had found her unconscious in their old apartment, an empty bottle of pills on the nightstand and a note that simply read he can't anymore. She'd looked through him as if he were made of glass, her once vibrant eyes flat and empty. The second visit, a year later, she'd asked him not to come back. "You've done your duty," she'd said in a voice like autumn leaves. "Let me have what's left of my dignity." So he had. He'd paid the bills, ensured she had the best care money could buy, and told himself he was respecting her wishes. The truth was simpler and more damning. He'd been relieved not to face the wreckage of what they'd once been, not to see his own failures reflected in her hollow stare. A second piece of paper had fallen from the envelope onto the gravel at his feet. Frank picked it up with unsteady hands and unfolded it. "Frank, if you're reading this, then I'm finally free. And you're probably wondering why I waited so long to let go. The answer is simple. I was waiting for you to find Tommy, to fix what we both broke. He came to see me last month. He's hurting, Frank, more than either of us realized. He's been carrying our failure for 20 years, blaming himself for not being enough to make you stay. I told him the truth, that it was never his fault, that we failed him, not the other way around." I know what happened tonight at your party. Tommy told me his plan, and I couldn't talk him out of it. He needs to hurt you the way we hurt him. But more than that, he needs his father to finally see him. I'm tired, Frank. Tired of being angry. Tired of waiting for you to become the man I thought I married. But Tommy isn't tired. He's drowning. And he's the only good thing we ever made together. Don't let him slip away like you let me slip away. Don't let him end up in a place like this, broken by dreams and disappointment. Save him, Frank. It's the last role that matters. Eleanor Frank Morrison sat alone in the garden, Hollywood's most beloved star, holding the words of a dead woman while his son's desperate act finally made terrible sense. The party continued above him, 300 people celebrating another successful picture, another triumph in the endless pageant of dreams. But for Frank Morrison, the performance was finally over. The letter slipped from Frank's fingers and drifted to the gravel like a dying moth. He stared at it for a long moment, Eleanor's careful handwriting blurring as his eyes filled with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in decades. The fountain beside him continued its endless murmur, indifferent to the collapse of a man's carefully constructed world. Save him, Frank. It's the last role that matters. He could hear voices approaching from the terrace above, Maureen's sharp tones cutting through the night air as she issued damage control instructions to someone, probably Kellerman. They'd be looking for him soon, wanting to manage the narrative, spin tonight's disaster into something palatable for the morning trades. The machine of Hollywood never stopped turning, never paused for inconvenient truths or broken hearts. Frank forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady beneath him. He folded Eleanor's letter with mechanical precision and slipped it into his jacket pocket beside his blood-stained handkerchief. When he looked up, he found a figure standing in the shadows near the garden's edge. A man in an expensive suit who stepped forward with the careful gait of someone accustomed to moving through dangerous territory. Frank Morrison? The voice carried a slight accent, possibly Italian. My apologies for intruding on your privacy. Frank wiped his eyes quickly, muscle memory reasserting itself. I'm sorry. Do we know each other? Vincent Torino. The man extended a manicured hand. I own several nightclubs downtown. The Flamingo, Casablanca, a few others you might have heard of. Frank had indeed heard of them, establishments where the city's power brokers conducted business that never appeared in board meeting minutes. He shook Torino's hand cautiously, noting the firm grip and the way the man's eyes catalogued everything without seeming to look directly at anything. I couldn't help but notice the incident earlier this evening, Torino continued, his tone conversational. That young man seemed quite upset. Tommy Castellano, wasn't it? The casual mention of Tommy's name sent ice through Frank's veins. I'm not sure what you're getting at, Mr. Torino. Oh, nothing sinister. It's just that Tommy's been frequenting my establishments lately, drinking heavily, gambling more than he can afford, running up considerable debts. Torino paused, letting the implications settle. I have to say, after seeing him tonight, his behavior makes more sense. Frank felt the ground shifting beneath him again. Another landslide in an evening full of them. What kind of debts? The expensive kind. 15,000 and climbing. He's been chasing his losses, you understand. Very common among actors between pictures. They get desperate, start believing their own publicity about being invincible. Torino's smile was thin as a blade. Of course, my business partners aren't particularly interested in the psychology behind unpaid debts. $15,000. Frank's mind raced through the implications. Tommy was barely scraping by on occasional bit parts and walk-on roles. That kind of money might as well have been $15 million. Why are you telling me this? Professional courtesy. I knew your father back in the day. Michael Morrison was a good man. Helped my family when we first came to this country. I remember when you were just starting out doing those serials at Republic Pictures. Torino's expression softened slightly. Family matters, Mr. Morrison, more than anything else in this world. The mention of his father, dead 10 years now, struck Frank like a physical blow. Michael Morrison had been everything Frank pretended to be on screen. Honorable, reliable, present. He'd run a small hardware store in Burbank and never missed one of his son's school plays, even when Frank had started believing his own dreams were more important than anyone else's reality. What do you want? Frank's voice came out hoarser than intended. Nothing. Consider this a gift, in memory of your father. But Frank, may I call you Frank? Time is not on your side here. My partners are less sentimental than I am. A week, maybe two, before they start looking for alternative forms of payment. Torino turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, I thought your reaction tonight was admirable. A lesser man would have had security throw him out. But sometimes the right thing and the smart thing aren't the same thing. That boy needs help, not just money, the kind of help only a father can provide. Frank watched Torino disappear into the shadows, leaving him alone with the weight of Eleanor's words and the growing certainty that his son was drowning in ways he'd never imagined. Above him, the party continued its elaborate charade, but Frank Morrison remained in the garden, surrounded by the ruins of everything he'd thought he understood about his carefully ordered life. The performance, he realized, had only just begun. Frank Morrison stood in the garden shadows for what felt like hours, though the Beverly Hills Hotel's ornate clock tower showed only 20 minutes had passed since Torino's departure. The gangster's words echoed in his mind, a week, maybe two, each repetition tightening the vice that seemed to be closing around his chest. $15,000. In his world, it was lunch money, a tip for his stunt coordinator. In Tommy's world, it was a death sentence. The sound of approaching footsteps made him straighten, but instead of Maureen's clicking heels, he heard the deliberate gait of dress shoes on gravel. A figure emerged from the darkness. A tall man in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd spent decades navigating Hollywood's treacherous waters. "Hello, Frank?" Frank's blood turned to ice water. Jesus Christ, Charlie. Charles Castellano looked older than his 64 years, the kind of weathered handsomeness that had served him well during his own brief acting career in the 30s. He'd been a second-tier leading man then, good enough for B pictures, but lacking the indefinable quality that separated stars from mere actors. Now he was one of the most powerful agents in Hollywood, the man who could make or break careers with a single phone call. He was also Tommy's uncle, Eleanor's brother, the man who'd threatened to destroy Frank's career if he ever came near his family again. "You son of a bitch," Charlie said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that Frank had only heard in his own performances. 20 years I've waited for this moment." Frank took an involuntary step backward, but Charlie followed, closing the distance between them with predatory intent. "Charlie, I can explain." "Explain what?" "How you abandoned my sister when she needed you most? How you left your son to fend for himself while you played cowboy for the cameras?" Charlie's composure cracked slightly, revealing the rage beneath. "Do you know what Eleanor looked like the last time I saw her? Like a ghost, Frank. A fucking ghost with dead eyes and needle tracks on her arms from all the treatments." The words hit Frank like physical blows. He'd known Eleanor was receiving treatment, but he'd chosen not to ask for specifics, not to dig too deeply into the reality of her condition. Another failure, another willful blindness that had let him sleep at night while his family disintegrated. "I paid for her care," Frank said weakly. "The best facility—" "Your money." Charlie's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Your goddamn money, like that could fix what you broke. You know what she told me before she died? She said she'd been waiting for you to visit, just once more. Waiting for you to show up and prove you still cared enough to try." Frank felt something crucial break inside his chest, a snapping sensation like rigging cables giving way under too much strain. "She told me not to come. She said she was protecting what was left of her pride, you selfish bastard. She was dying inside that place, and she still couldn't bear the thought of you seeing her that way." Charlie stepped closer, and Frank could smell bourbon on his breath, see the red-rimmed eyes that spoke of recent tears. But Tommy, Christ, Tommy kept hoping, kept believing maybe his famous father would remember he existed. The garden seemed to tilt around Frank, reality reshaping itself into something far more terrible than he'd imagined. "I didn't know he was struggling. The debts, the gambling—" "Of course you didn't know. You never bothered to look." Charlie pulled a cigarette from his jacket with shaking fingers, struck a match that illuminated his face in harsh planes of light and shadow. "You want to know what your boy's been doing for money, besides the poker games and the ponies? He's been taking jobs from people like Torino, collection work, muscle for hire, my nephew, Eleanor's son, breaking kneecaps for bookies because his father couldn't be bothered to acknowledge his existence. The words hit Frank like a succession of sledgehammer blows. Tommy, gentle Tommy who used to cry over injured birds, using his fists to intimidate desperate men. The boy who'd once asked if heroes were real, becoming everything Frank had spent his career pretending to stand against. "He came to me last month," Charlie continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Begged me to call you, to ask for help. Said he knew you probably hated him, but maybe if I explained how desperate things were." The cigarette trembled between his fingers. "I told him you weren't worth the humiliation, that you'd made your choice 20 years ago." Frank opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What defense could he offer against the truth? What justification existed for 2 decades of willful absence, of choosing the comfortable lie over the inconvenient reality? "So, tonight," Charlie said, he decided to make his own introduction, to show Hollywood's great moral hero exactly what his choices had created. The agent dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. "Congratulations, Frank. You finally got your son's attention." Charlie turned to leave, then paused, his voice carrying across the garden like a final verdict. "She's being buried Thursday morning. Forest Lawn. Eleanor always hoped you'd be there when it mattered." Frank Morrison stood alone among the flowers, surrounded by the wreckage of every lie he'd ever told himself, while 20 years of buried truth clawed its way toward the surface of his carefully constructed world. The garden fell silent except for the endless whisper of water over stone. Frank remained frozen beside the fountain, Charlie's words reverberating through his skull like gunshots in an empty theater. "Eleanor always hoped you'd be there when it mattered." The accusation hung in the air, indicting not just his absence tonight, but every absence that had come before it. He pulled Eleanor's letter from his pocket and read it again. But this time, the words rearranged themselves into a different truth. "He came to see me last month." Tommy had gone to his dying mother first, not because he wanted to, but because Frank had made himself unreachable. The son had sat beside Eleanor's hospital bed, probably holding her hand while she slipped away by degrees, carrying the weight of Frank's abandonment like a stone in his chest. "Don't let him slip away like you. Let me slip away." Frank's carefully constructed memories began to crack and crumble. All these years, he'd told himself he'd respected Eleanor's wishes, that staying away had been a kindness. But Charlie's fury had torn away that comfortable lie, revealing the ugly truth beneath. Frank had abandoned them because facing his failures was harder than playing pretend for the cameras. The sound of footsteps on the terrace above made him look up. Through the garden's decorative lattice, he could see figures moving against the ballroom's golden light. His guests, his colleagues, the assembled pillars of Hollywood society continuing their celebration as if nothing had changed. Maureen would be working the room now, her practiced smile deflecting questions about the unfortunate incident with smooth lies about method actors and artistic temperament. But everything had changed. In the space of an hour, Frank Morrison's entire world had been revealed as an elaborate stage set, beautiful from the audience's perspective, but held together with cheap paint and rotting timber. The man he'd spent 20 years pretending to be, the honorable hero, the moral center, was nothing but a character in an endless performance. He thought about Tommy's face in that moment before the glass shattered against the mirror. Not just rage, but something deeper, recognition. Tommy hadn't thrown that glass to humiliate a stranger. He'd thrown it to wound his father, to force Frank to see what his choices had created. The abandoned boy had become a man who broke kneecaps for gamblers and drank away his pain in Vincent Torino's nightclubs, and Frank had been too busy polishing his image to notice. "I told him you weren't worth the humiliation." Charlie's words cut deepest because they carried the weight of earned authority. Eleanor's brother had watched Frank's rise to stardom from the beginning, had seen him transform from the earnest young actor who'd promised to love and protect his family into the calculating star who'd chosen fame over fatherhood. Charlie had been there to pick up the pieces when Frank walked away, probably helping to pay Tommy's rent and listening to Eleanor's late-night phone calls when the loneliness became unbearable. The letter in Frank's hands felt suddenly heavy, weighted with implications he'd been too self-absorbed to understand. Eleanor had known about Tommy's plan tonight. She'd tried to talk him out of it, but she'd also understood why he needed to do it. Her son required more than money or fame. He needed his father to finally see him, to acknowledge the damage that 20 years of neglect had caused. Frank closed his eyes and tried to remember the last real conversation he'd had with Tommy, not the awkward encounters at industry events where they'd exchanged pleasantries like polite strangers, but an actual father-son moment when Frank had looked into his boy's eyes and asked how he was doing. The memory refused to surface because it had never existed. Even when Tommy was small, Frank had been mentally rehearsing lines, calculating career moves, treating his own family like background players in the epic drama of his ascension. Save him, Frank. It's the last role that matters. Eleanor's final request wasn't really about Tommy, Frank realized. It was about salvaging whatever remained of Frank's humanity. She was offering him a chance at redemption, but only if he could find the courage to step away from the spotlight and become the father he should have been from the beginning. A week, maybe 2. That's how long Tommy had before Torino's partners lost patience with mounting debts and unfulfilled promises. Frank could write a check tomorrow morning and make the financial problem disappear, but the deeper damage would remain. 20 years of accumulated hurt couldn't be healed with money. It would require Frank to do something he'd spent his entire career avoiding: reveal his true self, admit his failures, and accept that his greatest performance had been his most devastating lie. The party continued above him, but Frank Morrison remained in the garden, finally understanding that tonight's confrontation hadn't been an ending but a beginning. His son had thrown more than glass at that mirror. He'd thrown down a challenge that would determine whether Frank Morrison, the man, could finally become worthy of the hero he'd pretended to be. Frank pulled himself up from the fountain's edge, Eleanor's letter still clutched in his trembling fingers. The party above continued its elaborate masquerade, but he could no longer be part of that performance. Not tonight. Not anymore. He climbed the garden steps with the deliberate pace of a man walking to his execution, each footfall echoing his heartbeat against stone. The terrace door stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow him back into the glittering lie of his public life. But instead of entering, Frank pressed himself against the wall beside the doorframe, hidden in shadow, watching the scene unfold inside. Maureen held court near the bar, her practiced smile never wavering as she fielded questions about Tommy's outburst. "Method actors, you know how they are," she was saying to a cluster of studio executives. Frank was magnificent, really. Turn the other cheek like the Christian gentleman he is. The words made Frank's stomach turn. Even now, his publicist was spinning the evening's catastrophe into another chapter of the Frank Morrison mythology. The unflappable hero, gracious even in the face of unprovoked assault. She'd probably have the story in tomorrow's trades. Another anecdote about Hollywood's most beloved leading man. "Excuse me, Mrs. Morrison?" Frank recognized the voice. Jack Kellerman from Variety, his notebook already in hand. "Is it true the young man claimed to be related to your husband? Some of the guests are saying—" "Nonsense," Maureen cut him off smoothly. "Just a disturbed individual looking for attention. You know how these types gravitate toward successful people, trying to claim some connection." Frank closed his eyes, feeling each lie like a physical blow. His wife was erasing Tommy from existence with the same efficiency she'd used to manage every other inconvenient truth in their marriage. How many times had she performed this same dance, protecting the Frank Morrison brand from the messy reality of Frank Morrison the man? A hand touched his shoulder, and Frank spun around, expecting another confrontation. Instead, he found himself face to face with Ben Crawford, his longtime stunt coordinator. The older man's weathered features were creased with concern. "You okay, boss? You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank almost laughed at the accuracy of that assessment. Something like that. Ben studied him with the keen eye of someone who'd spent 30 years watching actors hide behind masks. That boy in there, before security hauled him away, he had your eyes, Frank. Same green, same fire behind them. The observation hit Frank like a physical blow. Of course Ben would notice. The man had worked with Frank since his early serial days, had watched him transform from an earnest young actor into Hollywood royalty. Ben had probably seen Tommy around the studio lots over the years, doing bit work and background roles, and wondered about the resemblance. "Ben, none of my business," the older man said quietly. "But I've got kids of my own, and I know what regret looks like." He glanced toward the ballroom where Maureen continued her damage control. "Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is stop pretending to be brave." Ben melted back into the shadows, leaving Frank alone with the weight of truth. Through the doorway, he could see Walter Harrison approaching Maureen, his expression grim. The studio head would want answers. Real answers, not publicity-friendly deflections. Iron Will Morrison was scheduled to start shooting in 6 weeks, and any scandal that threatened the film's success would be met with swift, ruthless action. Frank thought about Tommy sitting in a police cell somewhere, probably still drunk, definitely still furious. His son would be processed, fingerprinted, photographed, another humiliation to add to 20 years of accumulated wounds. The morning papers would carry the story, if they hadn't killed it already. Disturbed actor attacks film legend. Maureen would make sure Tommy was portrayed as an unhinged nobody, erasing any mention of family connections, unless Frank stopped it, unless he finally found the courage to tell the truth. The letter crinkled in his pocket as he shifted position. It's the last roll that matters. Eleanor had known this moment would come, had seen the collision course between father and son from her hospital bed. She'd tried to prepare him, to give him the tools he'd need when pretending was no longer possible. Frank pushed away from the wall and walked toward the ballroom's entrance. Every step felt like a choice: continue the performance or shatter it completely. Behind him lay 20 years of careful construction, the Frank Morrison mythology that had made him wealthy and beloved. Ahead lay the unknown territory of truth, messy and painful and utterly without script. He paused at the threshold, watching Maureen's performance with new eyes. She was protecting him, as she always did, weaving lies into a safety net that would let him fall back into comfortable fiction. All he had to do was walk inside, smile at the reporters, and let her erase Tommy from existence. Frank Morrison took a deep breath and stepped into the light, finally ready to stop being the hero long enough to become a father. Maureen's smile never wavered, but Frank caught the flash of warning in her eyes. "Stay silent. Let me handle this. Trust the performance." 20 years of marriage compressed into a single look, a lifetime of shared deceptions offered like a lifeline. All he had to do was nod, take his place beside her, and let the machinery of image management grind Tommy into dust. Instead, Frank walked to the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that familiar authority that had commanded attention in 100 films, "I owe you all an explanation." Walter Harrison stepped forward, his studio head instinct screaming danger. "Frank, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "The young man who disrupted our evening," Frank continued, ignoring the interruption, "is my son." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Frank felt the room's energy shift, felt the careful architecture of his public persona beginning to crumble. Maureen's face went pale beneath her makeup, and Jack Kellerman's pencil froze above his notepad. "Tommy Castellano," Frank said, each word deliberate as a nail driven into a coffin. "Born Thomas Morrison 24 years ago, son of Eleanor Morrison, who died 3 days ago from cancer." The silence deepened, becoming something almost tangible. Frank could feel decades of careful construction collapse around him, could sense careers recalculating and alliances shifting in real time. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he was standing on solid ground. "I abandoned them," he continued, his voice steady as scripture. "Chose this life, this career, over the family I'd promised to protect. Eleanor raised our boy alone while I played heroes for the cameras. She died alone while I celebrated my latest contract." Maureen finally found her voice. "Frank, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying." He turned to face his wife, seeing clearly for the first time the woman who'd helped him perfect the art of beautiful lies. "I'm saying our marriage has been a performance, Maureen. A 20-year run playing the perfect Hollywood couple." The room erupted in whispers, but Frank pressed on, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Tommy came here tonight to force me to see what I'd created. A boy who grew up believing his father chose strangers over his own son. A man who breaks bones for bookies because he never learned he was worth more than that." Charlie Brennan stood near the back of the room, his agent's face unreadable. But Frank caught something in his former brother-in-law's eyes: surprise, perhaps even respect. Charlie had waited 20 years for this moment, for Frank to finally acknowledge the wreckage he'd left behind. "I failed as a father," Frank said, his voice growing stronger with each confession. "I failed as a husband to the woman who gave me everything. I've spent 2 decades building a reputation based on honor and integrity, while abandoning every real obligation I ever had." Walter Harrison tried once more to salvage the situation. "Frank, think about what you're doing. Iron Will starts production in 6 weeks. The studio invested in a lie," Frank said flatly. "They invested in a man who doesn't exist." He pulled Eleanor's letter from his pocket, unfolded it with reverent care. My real wife wrote me something before she died. She said the last role is the one that matters." The room had become a theater now, with Frank Morrison delivering the performance of his life. But this time, the role was himself: flawed, broken, human. The manufactured hero was dying before their eyes, replaced by something far more dangerous: truth. "I'm withdrawing from Iron Will," Frank announced, the words falling like thunder. "I'm stepping away from all my contracts, all my commitments. I have a son to save and 20 years of damage to repair." Maureen's careful composure finally cracked. "You're destroying everything we've built." "I'm destroying everything he built on the bones of my family," Frank corrected. "You'll be fine, Maureen. You always land on your feet." He folded Eleanor's letter and returned it to his pocket, then looked out over the assembled crowd: producers, directors, agents, the entire machinery of Hollywood power. Many of them looked stunned, others calculating, a few oddly moved by this glimpse of genuine emotion in a town built on beautiful pretense. "Tommy's being held at Beverly Hills Police," Frank said. "I'm going to post his bail, and then I'm going to try to earn back the right to call myself his father." He straightened his shoulders, one last time, the hero's posture that had defined him for decades. "It's the last role that matters." Frank Morrison walked toward the exit, leaving behind the wreckage of his legend and stepping, finally, toward the harder work of becoming a man worthy of his son's forgiveness. Tommy emerged from processing with the careful gait of a man testing his sobriety. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been in the ballroom. Father and son regarded each other across the booking area's wasteland of bureaucracy, 2 strangers connected by blood and separated by decades of accumulated silence. "Why?" Tommy's voice was hoarse from whiskey and shouting, but the question carried the weight of a lifetime. Frank stood slowly, feeling every one of his 58 years. "Because Eleanor asked me to save you. Because I finally understood that I've been playing a hero while you needed a father." They walked to Frank's Cadillac in silence, the Beverly Hills night air sharp with the scent of orange blossoms and dying dreams. The wrap party would be ending now, Frank realized, guests filtering back to their homes and hotel suites, already crafting the story they'd tell about the night Frank Morrison's legend died in public view. "I saw the trades this morning," Tommy said as they drove through empty streets lined with palm trees and broken promises. "Maureen's people worked fast. Beloved star suffers breakdown following tragic family loss. Very neat, very clean." Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Maureen always was good at her job." "Protecting your image, you mean? Protecting the lie I paid her to maintain." They ended up at an all-night diner in West Hollywood, the kind of place where faded starlets nursed coffee until dawn and character actors counted their rent money. Frank ordered black coffee and watched Tommy methodically work through a plate of eggs and toast, the careful eating of a man who'd known hunger. "Eleanor used to make me eggs like this," Tommy said without looking up. "Sunday mornings when you were away. She'd tell me stories about the father who was going to come home someday." The words hit Frank like physical blows. She was a better person than I deserved. She was everything I had. Tommy finally met his eyes across the Formica table. "Do you know what it's like, growing up knowing your father chose strangers over you? Every movie poster, every magazine cover, there you were, being everyone's hero except mine." Frank set down his coffee cup with trembling hands. "I told myself I was protecting you both, that the industry would destroy you if they knew about Eleanor, about the life I'd left behind. You were protecting yourself." Yes, the admission came easier than Frank expected. "I was a coward who wrapped his cowardice in noble lies." They sat in silence while the diner's neon sign buzzed overhead like an electric conscience. Through the windows, Frank could see the first pale suggestions of dawn touching the Hollywood hills. Somewhere up there, Maureen was probably fielding calls from Walter Harrison and the studio lawyers, crafting new stories to contain the damage. "Vincent Torino wants his money by Friday," Tommy said quietly. 15,000, plus interest. Frank nodded. "I'll take care of it. And then what? You write me a check and disappear for another 20 years? The question hung between them like a blade. Frank studied his son's face, Eleanor's delicate features hardened by disappointment, green eyes that mirrored his own but carried depths of pain Frank had never known. "I don't know," Frank said finally. "I've spent so long pretending to be someone else, I'm not sure who Frank Morrison really is. But I'd like to find out, with your help if you'll have me." Tommy's laugh was bitter as black coffee. "You want me to teach you how to be my father? I want to learn how to be the man Eleanor thought I could become." The sun was fully up by the time they left the diner, painting the smog-hazed sky in shades of amber and regret. Frank drove Tommy to a modest apartment building in Silver Lake, the kind of place where dreams went to die quietly. They stood beside the car, two men connected by blood but separated by oceans of accumulated hurt. "Eleanor's funeral is Thursday," Tommy said. "St. Mary's in Burbank, 2 o'clock. Frank nodded, understanding this was both invitation and test. "I'll be there." Tommy started toward the building, then paused. "Frank, that thing you said about the last role being the one that matters? Eleanor used to say something like that. She said the only performance that counts is the one nobody sees." Frank Morrison watched his son disappear into the building's shadows, then drove home through a Hollywood morning that felt different, somehow smaller perhaps, but infinitely more real. The hero was dead, but somewhere in the wreckage a father was learning to breathe.